Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are excited to have you with us this morning to continue our discussion about the requirements of the modern slavery legislation. Today's webinar builds on the information we shared with you during our first session earlier this week and is intended to provide you with information and some practical suggestions regarding steps that your organization can take to prepare the report that is compliant with the requirements under the Modern Slavery Act. So I am pleased to introduce, or in some cases reintroduce, my co-presenter, Alexandra Gosse. Alex is a corporate lawyer at McInnes Cooper. She primarily advises clients in the energy and natural resources sector and regularly advises on ESG matters, including modern slavery. I am a partner at the Halifax office of McInnes Cooper, and my practice involves advising private and public companies on corporate and securities law matters, corporate governance, including ESG as well. So you have a question box function in the webcast. So we would encourage you to put your questions in the question box as we go along, and then at the end of the presentation we did save some time to answer those questions, and we would we'd be happy to answer those. So slide 2 will be a little bit of a repeat for those of you who have attended our first session earlier this week. However, I see there are some new faces joining us today, so this is just briefly for their benefit. So the Modern Slavery Act, which its full name is Fighting Against Forced Labor and Child Labor in Supply Chains Act, took effect in January of 2024 this year. It is referred as the Modern Slavery Act, or simply as the MSA. Earlier in December of 2023, Public Safety Canada launched its website and released guidelines on providing some clarifications on what entities would be captured by the Act, are intended to be captured by the Act, and how they should prepare and submit the report. Those guidelines were subsequently updated in March of this year. The Act, the Modern Slavery Act, augments the existing legislation. It amended the Canadian Custom Tariffs Acts to also prohibit the importation of goods mined, manufactured, or produced with child labor. It initially prohibited that forced labor, but it now added the child labor prohibition as well. This act serves as a transparency tool to aid the fight against modern slavery, and it aims to eradicate forced labor and child labor from the Canadian supply chains. So the questions that we first want to address is, what is forced labor and what is child labor? Forced labor is essentially defined as work that is provided involuntarily or under threat. It addresses situations where a person is coerced to work. Child labor is work that is mentally, physically, socially, or morally dangerous for children or interferes with their right to education. So this act imposes reporting obligations on certain entities that meet a two-part test in the act, set out in the act, the details of which we've addressed in our presentation earlier this week. The act covers governmental institutions and private entities. We are focusing in this webinar on private entities, and we'll aim to provide you with some helpful tips on how to approach the requirement to report, to prepare and file the report. So with that, we have developed a 5-step approach. Once if it's determined that your organization is considered a reporting entity under the Act, which is required to file a modern slavery report, then it is, and it's really important to look at your entity globally in terms of your entire corporate structure, given the complexities of the Act. We recommend breaking it down into 5 steps so that you provide, you break down the process into these 5 steps and prepare yourself to complete the required disclosure and to avoid any incomplete or misleading disclosure. So as step 1, we do recommend familiarizing yourself with the disclosure requirements and understanding what needs to be done and what needs to be disclosed. Step 2 is essentially mapping out your corporate structure and supply chains. This can be pretty simple for organizations that perhaps have one entity, but it can be quite complex for larger organizations. Step 3, that is conducting a self-audit of your organizations, looking at the contract, at your practices, at your policies, and measures that you may have in place or may want to develop as well in relation to this exercise. Step 4 is assess and remediate risks. And so in this one, you would be looking at what parts of your business or supply chain carry a risk of modern slavery, what and where those risks are, what measures you've already taken to address those risks, if any, and consider if you have any gaps. And then once you have gone through these 4 steps, then you would be you'd be ready to start completing the disclosure obligations and the disclosure requirements. So we will discuss each of those steps separately and provide a little bit more detail on each of those recommended steps. So both the Act and the guidelines are published on the Canada Public Safety website, where you can find all information in one place for your review and consideration. And although the guidelines have been published to assist with your understanding of the reporting requirements under the Act, we just wanted to note that there are some minor discrepancies between the Act and the guidance, which are of note, and I think Alex will address those in her slides later on. But we'll try to help you navigate through all of that today to make sure that you understand your reporting requirements. It is important to know what needs to be disclosed and for which entities within your group, as I mentioned, and that will guide you through your information gathering process. And as I mentioned, that can be very simple for some companies or quite complex, and you may have to assemble a group of, from various departments within your company, including legal, finance, procurement, etc. So planning for this is crucial. So further on with the disclosure requirements, if you want to advance the slide, Alex. So there are 2 components. One of them is online questionnaire, and the other one is the report itself. So you would be completing the online questionnaire concurrently with sending the report to the government. It is mandatory to complete, and you can review the questionnaire in advance. It is helpful to look at the questionnaire in advance of completing the report, because it can act as a template or a guide to help you develop your report. The report, as I think we mentioned a few times, is due to be filed with the government by May 31st, although we would strongly suggest that it be filed earlier than that to avoid any issues, any last-minute issues. There's also a requirement to post it in a prominent place on your website following your submissions to the Public Safety Canada. Federal entities, so that would be companies incorporated under the CBCA, banks or federal non-for-profits, also have to file the report with their corporate registry and send the report to their shareholders along with their annual financial statements. The legislation, unfortunately, does not provide much guidance as to the manner in which the report has to be provided to shareholders, but I guess the assumption would be that it would be in the same manner as the annual financials. One, I guess, point for public companies, federal public companies, is that the Act does not, the Modern Slavery Act does not tie in nicely with the corporate and securities legislation. So there's some additional considerations to be, I guess, thought of, and that would be the manner and delivery of the report, you know, and the mechanism for it, because many public companies do deliver those electronically or allow shareholders to opt in or opt out from receiving financial statements. So that those are some of the issues that you need to consider. You also need to consider whether you need to, advance sending the report to your shareholders in advance of filing it with the government, and finally whether you may want to file the report on CEDAR Plus along with all of your annual report and annual financials as a result of sending it to the shareholders. So that's generally on the disclosure requirements of the online questionnaire and the report. So maybe we'll move over to a little bit more information on the components of the online questionnaire. So the questionnaire is mandatory, and it has some mandatory and some optional questions. The mandatory questions essentially collect information about the reporting entity or entities to which the report relates. Other questions essentially are to gauge the compliance with the Act, and they are in relation to the activities that are targeted by the Act. There are about 30, if I'm not mistaken, mandatory check the box questions, but you also have optional questions in the online questionnaire, which allow you to expand perhaps on some of the answers that you provided to the mandatory questions. And these are free text questions where you can elaborate on your answers to the mandatory questions. I would say that given the growing pressures for corporate transparency and the increasing adoption of the ESG principles, and perhaps the fact that the questionnaire may become publicly accessible, this gives the companies an opportunity to demonstrate, to communicate with your shareholders, your stakeholders, and the general public about your leadership in this area and about the efforts that you're taking to mitigate those risks in relation to modern slavery. So as to the report itself, yes, so the report requires you to disclose what steps you've taken to prevent and reduce the risk that forced or child labor is used in any step in production of goods or of goods that you've imported into Canada during your previous financial year. It also has to report on supply chain risk. And that has to include, you will see on the right-hand side of the slide, a number of points. It has to include the structure, activities, and supply chains for your business, the policies and due diligence processes regarding the forced labor and child labor that you have in place, parts of the business, of your business and supply chains with risk of use of forced labor or child labor, and steps that you've taken to assess or manage that risk, any measures to remediate the risk for the use of forced labor or child labor, any corrective plans that you have in place, also measures that you've taken to remediate the loss of income to the most vulnerable families resulting from the measures that you have taken to eliminate the use of forced labor or child labor. The training that you have given to your employees on these issues. And I mean, formal training is one option, but there's awareness raising as well that is often addressed here that companies talk about. And you can also talk about any training or any discussions that you may have with your suppliers in relation to modern slavery. And finally, you have to discuss methods to assess effectiveness in ensuring your business and supply chains aren't employing forced and child labor. And it's important to remember that under this criteria, you just have to provide how you assess the effectiveness and not the results of your assessment. So if no actions, you have taken no actions, you can just say that and that will be sufficient. You don't actually have to come up with things at this point to necessarily provide in this report. So the purpose of the report is not to show that your company is risk-free, but what your company is doing and how it's assessing the effectiveness of those measures. So it is all about providing complete and accurate disclosure about your company's activities and reporting on the steps that you have taken to address these issues. And Alex will cover some additional components of the report later on, but the report will need to be approved by the board of directors of the entity. I would also say that the questionnaire needs to be, completion of the questionnaire should be authorized by the board. There's certain, Alex will cover prescribed attestation wording, and you know, we also recommend that anyone who signs the report, that they sign it in their capacity as a director and not in their personal capacity. So those are some components of the report that we would suggest you consider. So that is step one, essentially familiarizing yourself with the requirements of what you need to report and how to complete the report. So the next step would be mapping out your corporate structure and the structure of your supply chains. And so this is really important exercise, especially for companies that have complex corporate structures. And in particular, the size threshold that we've discussed in our presentation on Tuesday should be, you know, when you're looking at the structure, you know, as it's very important to determine which entities within your corporate group will meet the definition of entity. And just a reminder that, you know, when you're looking at that, you should be thinking about using your consolidated financial statements. The guidelines clarify that the consolidated financial statement means your revenue, assets, and employees, including those of any entity that you control, so your subsidiaries, and excluding those that control you, so the parents. So all of that is really important to have it in front of you when you are mapping out and considering which entity within your corporate structure is required to report. And in terms of your supply chains, this is, I think, the area where you need to talk to people in the various departments in your organization to make sure you look at the contract, you look at the arrangements that you have in place, and think carefully about the risks where they may lie. So for example, like based on the geography of your supply chain or based on the commodity type, what due diligence should be done to see what your suppliers are when they're sourcing their products, what monitoring you have in terms of, you know, the supply chain that you are using. Talk to your suppliers, consider how you will manage those relationships going forward, and perhaps consider creating some action plan for the future as to how you will monitor that, and perhaps even consider whether you need to change some suppliers as a result of what you've discovered during your due diligence investigations of the supply chains that are relevant for your business. So in terms of corporate structure, I'll ask Alex to advance to the next slide. Most of this we've already covered, so important to know what entities are reporting entities and how they need to fulfill their obligations. So mapping out and gathering information is really critical for this exercise, just making sure that you have someone from legal and financial assisting with figuring out whether you meet those thresholds, as that can be sometimes a tricky exercise. So moving on to reporting options, even if you have more than one entity within your structure that is required to report, there are options to file one report for all of your reporting entities within your structure. So the Act does provides a few reporting options. So there's a single report for each reporting entity, and this could be a separate report for your parent, for your subsidiaries. They just can do a single report for each entity that needs to report. You also have an option of a joint report, and this would be one report that covers all of the reporting entities in your group, in your corporate group. The guidelines, what they say that you have to bear in mind that the joint report is only appropriate if the reported information generally applies to all reporting entities. So it is, you should be careful when you're assessing that, because it would not be appropriate when there are different risk profiles for the different entities within your group. And there could be different reasons for that. It could be based on the location of your subsidiaries, based on sort of different lines of business that they're in, different supply chains. So that is something really important to consider if you're considering filing a joint report. And then finally, for companies that are operating in multiple jurisdictions, and I will mention that the UK and Australia had the modern slavery legislation in place for now a number of years. Some of those international companies already are used to filing those reports. So our Act does provide that you can use the report that you're filing in other jurisdictions, provided that it still complies with the specific requirements of the MSA. So if you are reproducing it, that's fine, but you just still need to make sure that you do comply with the Canadian requirements. And again, Alex will guide you through the approval requirements for each of those reports later on, based on the type of report that you will select to prepare and file. And I guess with that, I'll turn over to Alex to guide you through the mapping out the supply chain and the 3 steps in the last 3 steps in the process. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Basia. So yeah, further on step 2 with respect to your supply chain, once you've identified all the reporting entities, you should map out your entire supply chain for each. So on the slide here, you can see the guidelines. They clarify that the supply chain includes the suppliers of goods and services that contribute to your production of goods produced, sold, distributed, or imported, all the way from the sourcing of the raw materials to the final product. And the guidelines also cover both direct and indirect suppliers and service providers, both in and outside of Canada, but exclude end users or purchasers. So we note that there is inconsistency, as Basia mentioned, between the Act and what it requires and what the guidelines suggest. You really do need to comply with the Act. And then what you should do is look at the guidelines and determine what applies to you. And then, erring on the absolute side of caution, you should, again, comply with the Act and then aim to include everything required for you in the guidelines. So this is still such a new piece of legislation, so there'll likely be issues like this and ones that aren't even identified yet, and may not be fixed until sometime in the future. So this is the best approach. And then, depending on the extent of your supply chains, it might make it more manageable to break your suppliers into tier 1, being your direct suppliers, and then tier 2, being indirect, based on the materiality of your contracts involved in your business. So then, moving on to step 3, we recommend conducting a self-audit. So you'll gather your information about your activities, your supply chain, and then so you can identify the parts of your business that carry risk of using forced or child labor, and also identify the steps that you've already taken to assess and manage the risk in these key reporting areas, and you can then identify any gaps. So there isn't one approach here, and it's going to be dependent on your business. But one approach, as mentioned, would be to map out your tier 1 suppliers. and then you might conduct your due diligence on those. And then if any risk is identified, you might dig deeper into those tier 2 suppliers. And for example, if you find a contract from a supplier is high risk, but it's not material, you might choose to terminate that contract as an example. But again, there's not one approach, and you may need to be creative in addressing these issues, and you may also connect with your legal counsel for advice on which approach to take in your specific situation. So a few important things to keep in mind while you're moving through this process. The first being that Public Safety Canada did in their briefing publicly state that it understands that reporting entities might not yet have measures in place to report on for some or all of the reporting requirements. And if this is the case, then the reporting entities can state this in the report, and that'll be in compliance with the Act. And also to consider as you're working through these steps is that the guidelines do clarify that the report is intended as not intended as an aspirational statement. So you really need to be reporting on the concrete actions that your organization has taken. And the guidelines state that there is an understanding that some of these actions could span multiple years. So this is just something to be aware of when you're making statements, and particularly for any forward-looking statements. And then lastly, you might want to include measures you're taking that aren't solely related to child enforced labor. So this might include human rights, due diligence, and other ESG initiatives. So some key areas to look at when you're doing your self-audit are governance structure, your policies, and procurement. So at that governance structure level, you should consider whether there are appropriate governance structures in place to establish and maintain modern slavery disclosure controls and procedures. So you might also consider whether there is a board committee or a board working group responsible for overseeing modern slavery risk identification and mitigation. And here your governance structure, sets the tone for the rest of your organization. You then turn your mind to reviewing your policies and procedures regarding more specific aspects of your business. And you should ask whether you have any relevant policies and procedures and whether they're current, and particularly address forced and child labor. So examples of these policies might be a human rights policy, a corporate code of conduct or ethics, corporate responsibility guidelines, supplier code of conduct, whistleblower policy. And there might also be policies and procedures that are not obvious to you at first that they could be included. This might include your health and safety policies, temporary workers or contractor policies that relate to age verification and overtime and wages, and similarly any new hiring screening policies. And when you're reviewing your policies, it might be helpful to look at whether there are any human rights or responses to, human rights reports or responses to similar legislation in other jurisdictions that has already been completed by your organization. And then for procurement, you should review your supply chain and consider, whether you have a comprehensive list of all your suppliers and where they operate. And if you have procedures for supplier screening and ongoing diligence. So for example, do you have supplier contracts? Do they all include forced and child labor risk mitigation provisions? And throughout this process, you might even consider retaining a third party to help you conduct the self-audit. So lastly, you should also look at your internal education and training and consider what training you're conducting about forced and child labor at all the levels in your organization. So is it at the board of directors level? Is it at the employee level? So now moving on to step 4 of the approach would be to, now that you've gathered the necessary information, to use it and assess the forced labor and child labor risks in your business and your supply chain, and determine how you can remediate them. And so how do you actually assess the risks? So you should determine which parts of your business and your supply chain carry the risk. So in doing so, you might consider that certain regions or products might have higher risks associated with them. There are really good resources online that can be helpful in identifying these risks. For example, the Global Slavery Index, or the US Department of Labor's lists of goods produced by child or forced labor. And there's a lot of other resources out there. You then should determine measures, if any, that your organization has already taken to address the identified risks. And this will likely expose gaps, if any, in your risk mitigation measures. You may also make determinations such as whether your profit being generated from a higher risk project is worth the associated risk. So this is really specific to your organization, and you might even seek counsel about these specific risks. So moving on along to remediation of these risks. So remember that the Act doesn't require that you actually take the steps to remediate the risk, only that you disclose them. So it's really about transparency. And so the existence of gaps doesn't mean you aren't in compliance with the Act. The guidelines actually clarify that if you have assessed there is no risk of forced or child labor in your business or supply chains, then you can state this in your report and be in compliance with the Act. And alternatively, it may be the case that just no measures have been taken to remediate the forced labor or child labor risks, and stating this in your report is sufficient to address this requirement. And in either case, you should come up with policies and mitigation of risks and determine how you will measure these going forward. Because this is an annual report, and so your responses will likely change and evolve over time. So the final step is to fulfill your mandatory disclosure obligations. As Basia touched on, you have to complete the online questionnaire. So the guidelines actually confirm a failure to do so is considered an offense under the Act. So you have to complete the questionnaire. And while it's not clear yet whether the questionnaire will be publicly accessible in the same manner as the report, even if it's not, it's likely it'll be accessible through the federal access to information legislation. So it's important to keep in mind. And there's no obligation to report commercially sensitive information. So don't include personal or confidential information in your responses. And then the guidelines also set an attestation statement. To complete the questionnaire, you have to confirm you included the text of the suggested attestation statement verbatim, and you can't complete the questionnaire and report filing processes without it. So the questionnaire is relatively lengthy, and you should be aware that there's no save or submit option at the end of the questionnaire. Instead, you're instantly prompted to submit your report. So it's wise to be prepared to submit your report at the same time that you plan to complete the questionnaire. So in addition to the questionnaire, as mentioned, you need to complete and submit your report. And so the questionnaire and the report should be consistent. It is clear that the report will be publicly accessible. So again, don't include any commercially sensitive, personal, or confidential information in your report. Also, it's important to note that if you disclose anything that is inconsistent with other public disclosures that the organization has made, for example, in an ESG report or even information disclosed to employees, it will be picked up by interest groups. So similarly, if you disclose any information that has not been disclosed elsewhere. So you should just be aware of this when you're when you're completing your questionnaire and your report. So again, by this time, you'll have the information you need to decide whether to submit your single or your joint report. And if you submit a joint report, it must clearly identify the name of each reporting entity it covers. And the guidelines indicate that your report should state whether you also report under modern slavery laws of other jurisdictions. So that's an important point to consider, is that it would be wise to also ensure that this Canadian report is consistent with any other modern slavery reports that your organization has already submitted in another jurisdiction. And then with respect to submission, you must submit the report in one of two Canadian official languages, so English and French. And then the updated guidelines no longer state that the maximum report length is 10 pages, but it does recommend this as a maximum. And then the report must be in PDF format and not exceed 100 megabytes in size. And then once you've completed the questionnaire, you'll be prompted, as mentioned, to upload the tested report, and you'll receive a confirmation message. So the report approval is really important. It's prescribed under the Act. So the appropriate governing body or bodies must approve it. If you're submitting a single report, that's your governing body, which is typically your board of directors, that must approve it. And then if you're submitting a joint report, it can be either the governing body of each reporting entity covered by the report or the governing body of the parent reporting entity. And then you must also include in the report submission the signed attestation statement that the guidelines specifically set out. And just one more note about the approval process. So it's important that in signing the report, to know that directors will be required to exercise their fiduciary duty and act in the best interest of your organization. So this education piece becomes even more crucial. The board needs to understand the organization's reporting obligations under the Act and the organization's risks and their role in reporting. So this is where you might consider implementing that mandatory training so that the board is educated on this. And then so just on this slide here, you can see just a step-by-step by how the submission process goes. So it's questionnaire and uploading the report, submitting the report, and receiving a confirmation message. So a few last points to remember. Again, the report is going to be online and searchable on the Public Safety Canada website in a catalog. And then also you'll be required to publish your final submitted report on a prominent place on your website. And if you don't have a website, you should be prepared to produce a physical copy of the report to any member of the public who requests one. And then lastly, as Basia has mentioned, if you're a federally incorporated company, then you must also take the positive steps to provide the report to your shareholders along with your financial statements. So nowhere in the guidelines does it actually describe how you deliver this, but again, we expect this will evolve as time goes on with this annual report. But right now, it's just a broad statement that's left to companies to determine. And so if you are sending your report along with your financial statements, this may be earlier than May 31st, so you may already have. But you only need to submit the report May 31st. But one last point is, as Basia already mentioned, is not to wait until May 31st. There has been suspicions, that the website could even crash. So that's just another reason not to wait until the last minute.
We don't see any questions in the chat, so we'll be concluding today's presentation. But of course, please feel free to reach out to either one of us, and we would be happy to assist with any questions that you may have. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.